Good evening, my friends. Welcome back to Darkling Fables. Find yourself a comfortable spot, because tonight I'm taking you into one of the darkest chapters of naval history. Before we begin, I want to warn you that what you're about to hear is not fiction. Every terrifying moment I'm about to describe actually happened to real people, fathers, sons, brothers, who found themselves in a nightmare beyond imagination. I've spent months researching this story, interviewing survivors' families, poring through declassified military documents, and studying personal journals. What emerged is a tale of unimaginable horror, extraordinary courage, and one of the greatest injustices in American military history. So dim the lights, silence your phone, and join me as we dive into the harrowing true story of the USS Indianapolis and the men who faced the ocean's most perfect predator with nothing but their will to survive. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly beneath the hull of the USS Indianapolis, a vast, glittering mirror reflecting the July sun. Captain Charles McVay III stood on the bridge, watching the horizon with the quiet confidence of a man who had guided his heavy cruiser through 3 years of brutal Pacific warfare. It was July 30th, 1945, and the Indianapolis was sailing unescorted from Guam to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. The war was winding down. Japan was on its knees, and unknown to all but a handful of men aboard, the Indianapolis had just completed a secret mission that would change the course of human history, delivering components of the first atomic bomb to the island of Tinian. For many of the 1,195 men aboard, this peaceful transit was a welcome respite. The ship had seen its share of violence, surviving a kamikaze attack that killed 9 men, bombarding Iwo Jima, and participating in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. But tonight, the sea was calm, the sky clear, and the only sound was the steady churn of the cruiser's engines as it cut through the water at 17 knots. Seaman First Class Clarence Donner should have been aboard the Indianapolis that night. His bunk, his station, his place in the ship's carefully ordered universe was empty. A last-minute reassignment had kept him on shore, a random bureaucratic decision that would save his life. In his place was another young sailor, eager to get back to the fighting. Neither man could have known that this administrative shuffle would spark one of the greatest mysteries in naval history. As night fell, many of the crew not on duty retired to their bunks, lulled by the gentle roll of the ship. Some gathered for poker games on the deck. Others wrote letters home under the brilliant canopy of Pacific stars. In the radio room, operators maintained their usual vigilance, though with less urgency than during battle operations. No one had told them that they were sailing through waters where Japanese submarines had been spotted in recent days. No one had warned them that their ship lacked the underwater detection equipment that might alert them to danger. No destroyer escort had been provided, despite the captain's request. These omissions would haunt the U.S. Navy for decades to come. Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto peered through the periscope of the Japanese submarine I-58, his heart quickening as he spotted the silhouette of an American warship against the night sky. For weeks, his crew had patrolled these waters without encountering a worthy target. Now, through a stroke of incredible luck, a large American vessel had wandered into his crosshairs, sailing in a straight line, performing no evasive maneuvers. The Japanese commander had no idea he was looking at the USS Indianapolis, nor did he know of its secret mission. To him, it was simply an enemy ship, a chance to strike a blow for his crumbling empire. Hashimoto ordered his crew to prepare for attack. The I-58 carried a deadly new weapon, the Kaiden, a manned suicide torpedo. But tonight, Hashimoto opted for conventional torpedoes. At 12:14 a.m. on July 30th, 1945, he gave the order to fire. Below decks on the Indianapolis, 19-year-old Seaman First Class Richard Thielen had just come off duty. The Michigan native was settling into his bunk, thinking of home, of the fishing trips he'd take when this war was finally over. Sleep was just beginning to claim him when the world exploded. The first torpedo struck the starboard bow, ripping through the ship's hull and igniting a fuel tank. The second hit midship, detonating a powder magazine. The massive explosions tore through the vessel, killing hundreds instantly and trapping many more below decks as compartments flooded with shocking speed. On the bridge, Captain McVay was thrown to the deck by the concussive force. Struggling to his feet amid smoke and chaos, he tried desperately to assess the damage as alarms blared throughout the ship. Within moments, the Indianapolis began listing severely to starboard. Power failed completely, plunging the stricken vessel into darkness. No SOS could be transmitted. No distress call would alert the naval bases that they were in trouble. In the engine room, water rushed in with terrifying force. Machinist's mate Paul Murphy was thrown against a bulkhead, his legs shattering on impact. As he struggled to remain conscious, he saw several of his friends drowned instantly as water filled the compartment. With his remaining strength, Murphy dragged himself up a ladder, the rising water literally pushing him toward a hatch that offered his only escape. The Indianapolis was dying, and dying quickly. Captain McVay knew it instantly. With the ship's communications destroyed, he gave the order to abandon ship less than 15 minutes after the torpedoes hit. But in the chaos, with power out and many sailors trapped or already dead, the order couldn't reach everyone. Those fortunate enough to make it topside faced a harrowing choice: stay with the rapidly sinking ship or jump into the black Pacific waters. The Indianapolis, a vessel that had survived years of combat, slipped beneath the waves just 12 minutes after Hashimoto's attack, carrying hundreds of men down with it. Approximately 900 men made it into the water alive. Some had managed to deploy life rafts. Most had only their Capic life jackets. A few had nothing at all. As the survivors floated in the darkness, the full horror of their situation had yet to dawn on them. They believed rescue would come quickly. They were, after all, on a well-documented course. Someone would notice when they failed to arrive at Leyte Gulf the next day. They were wrong. Catastrophically wrong. The first night in the water passed in relative calm. The men clustered together in groups, calling out to each other in the darkness, taking roll calls, trying to stay organized and hopeful. Marine Private First Class Edgar Harrell found himself in a group of about 80 men, their life jackets creating a floating human island in the vast ocean. They assured each other that morning would bring rescue planes, that ships would already be steaming toward their position. Dawn brought the first indication that their ordeal would be far worse than any had imagined. The rising sun revealed hundreds of men scattered across miles of open ocean. Many were injured, suffering from burns, broken bones, and shrapnel wounds. The salt water exacerbated their pain, turning minor cuts into searing wounds. The sun itself became an enemy, its relentless heat beating down on men with no shade, no fresh water, no protection of any kind. But the sun brought something else, something that would transform their situation from desperate to nightmarish. As light penetrated the depths beneath them, the first shark fin cut through the water. The Pacific Ocean is home to several species of shark, including the oceanic whitetip, a particularly aggressive deep-water predator known to follow ships and investigate anything unusual in its territory. To these perfect killing machines, hundreds of thrashing, bleeding men in the water were an irresistible attraction. The first attack came around noon on the first day. A sailor on the edge of one group suddenly screamed, thrashed, and was pulled under. The water turned red, and panic spread through the survivors. More sharks appeared, circling the floating men, sometimes bumping against them, testing, tasting, before attacking. The sharks seemed to prefer solitary swimmers, picking off those who had drifted away from the main groups. Dr. Lewis Haynes, the ship's chief medical officer, had survived the sinking and found himself trying to treat the injured with no supplies, no medicine, and no hope of evacuation. He watched helplessly as men died from their injuries, from exposure, from drinking seawater in their desperate thirst, and he watched as sharks took the living one by one. The shrieks and screams as men were taken by sharks is something I'll never forget, Haynes later recalled in his diaries. There was nothing I could do for them, nothing any of us could do. By the second day, dehydration became as lethal an enemy as the sharks. Under the merciless sun, with no fresh water, men began to hallucinate. Some, driven mad by thirst, broke away from their groups and swam off in search of imagined islands or ships. Few returned. Others, in their delirium, began drinking seawater, despite warnings that it would only hasten their deaths. The salt poisoned their systems, accelerating dehydration and pushing them into madness. Captain McVay had survived the sinking and found himself responsible for a group of about 25 men clinging to a life raft. A career naval officer from a military family, McVay maintained discipline, rationing the meager supplies they had and forbidding seawater consumption. He led roll calls at regular intervals, both to account for his men and to keep their minds focused. As sharks continued to claim victims, McVay organized his group into a defensive formation, keeping the injured at the center. But nights brought different terrors. The temperature dropped sharply, and men who had baked during the day now shivered uncontrollably. The endless rhythm of the waves, exhausted swimmers struggling to keep their heads above water. Some men, overcome by fatigue, simply slipped below the surface when they could fight no longer. Others were taken by sharks, their final screams piercing the darkness and haunting those who could do nothing to help. And still, no rescue came. The third day brought a horrific discovery. The oil that had coated many survivors after the ship sank had begun to break down their skin. Open sores formed, providing more blood to attract sharks. The sun blistered exposed flesh. Eyes swelled shut from salt exposure. Lips cracked and bled. The men were literally disintegrating in the ocean. Marine Private Giles McCoy watched as his friend, delirious from drinking seawater, became convinced that the ship hadn't actually sunk. The young sailor removed his life jacket and dove down, insisting he was going to retrieve his shoes from his locker. He never resurfaced. "We lost as many men to madness as we did to sharks," McCoy later testified. Maybe more. By the fourth day, the survivors had dwindled dramatically. Bodies floated among the living, creating a macabre obstacle course. Some groups lashed the dead to their rafts, unable to let go of their friends and unwilling to release them to the sharks that continued to circle. This was when the most bizarre chapter of the Indianapolis tragedy began to unfold. Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn was piloting a PV-1 Ventura bomber on routine anti-submarine patrol when he noticed something unusual in the water below. Initially thinking he had spotted a Japanese submarine, he descended for a closer look. What he saw astonished him. Dozens of men floating in the water, surrounded by oil slicks and debris. Gwynn immediately radioed his base to report the discovery. Lieutenant Adrian Marks, piloting a PBY Catalina flying boat, diverted to the scene and confirmed the sighting. What they were seeing was the surviving crew of the USS Indianapolis, a ship the Navy hadn't even realized was missing. Here was the terrible truth. Due to a series of communication failures, security protocols, and bureaucratic oversights, the Indianapolis had never been reported overdue. When it failed to arrive at Leyte Gulf, no alarm was raised. Multiple stations had received partial SOS signals from the stricken ship, but each had different reasons for dismissing them. One commander thought it was a Japanese trick. Another was under orders not to break radio silence. A third believed another station was already responding. For 4 days, as hundreds of men died in the water, no one was looking for them. No search was underway. The USS Indianapolis, carrying nearly 1,200 souls, had disappeared into the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. And the United States Navy, engaged in coordinating the largest naval war in history, hadn't noticed. The rescue, when it finally came, was chaotic and heroic in equal measure. Lieutenant Marks made the extraordinary decision to land his PBY in open ocean, a dangerous maneuver under the best circumstances, potentially suicidal in the rough seas. He and his crew pulled 56 survivors from the water, stacking them on the wings of the aircraft when the fuselage was full. The destroyer USS Cecil J. Doyle arrived hours later, the first of many ships that would join the rescue effort. Captain McVay was among those saved, pulled from the water after nearly 4 days adrift. Of the approximately 900 men who had survived the initial sinking, only 316 were found alive. The rest had succumbed to exposure, dehydration, salt poisoning, shark attacks, or their injuries. It was, and remains, the worst disaster at sea in U.S. naval history. But the tragedy of the USS Indianapolis didn't end with the rescue. In a decision that would generate controversy for decades, the Navy court-martialed Captain McVay for hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag. It was the only time in naval history that a captain was court-martialed for losing his ship in an act of war. The trial itself contained extraordinary elements. In an unprecedented move, the Navy brought Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine commander who had sunk the Indianapolis, to testify. Surprisingly, Hashimoto stated that zigzagging would have made no difference. He would have sunk the ship regardless of its evasive maneuvers. Despite this testimony, McVay was convicted. Though his sentence was commuted, his naval career was effectively over, and he carried the stigma of the conviction for the rest of his life. Former crew members of the Indianapolis maintained that McVay had been made a scapegoat to protect higher-ranking officers who had failed to provide escort vessels, failed to warn McVay of enemy submarine activity in his path, and failed to notice when his ship went missing. The aftermath of the Indianapolis disaster rippled through the lives of survivors and the families of the lost. The men who had lived through those horrific days in the water carried psychological scars as lasting as their physical ones. Many reported lifelong fear of water. Others suffered from guilt, questioning why they had survived when so many others had perished. Nightmares of circling shark fins and the screams of the dying haunted them for decades. For Captain McVay, the burden proved unbearable. On November 6, 1968, more than 20 years after the court-martial, he took his own life. He was found in his garden, a toy sailor in one hand, his service revolver in the other. Among his personal effects were letters from relatives of Indianapolis sailors who had died. some still blaming him for the loss of their loved ones. The story might have ended there, another tragic footnote in the vast narrative of World War II, but for an unlikely champion who emerged decades later. In 1996, a 12-year-old schoolboy named Hunter Scott began researching the Indianapolis for a history fair project. What started as a simple school assignment evolved into a crusade that would eventually reach the halls of Congress. Scott, astonished by the injustice of McVay's court-martial, began contacting survivors, collecting their testimonies, and advocating for the captain's exoneration. His persistent efforts, combined with a growing coalition of survivors, historians, and legislators, led to congressional hearings on the matter. In October 2000, following testimony from Indianapolis survivors and a thorough review of the evidence, Congress passed a resolution expressing that Captain McVay's military record should reflect that he is exonerated for the loss of the USS Indianapolis. President Bill Clinton signed the measure, officially clearing McVay's name, though the conviction was never formally overturned. For the aging survivors, the exoneration came as bittersweet validation. Their captain, who had shared their ordeal and carried the unfair burden of blame, was finally recognized as another victim of the disaster rather than its cause. But the gesture came too late for McVay himself. In 2017, a team led by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen located the wreckage of the USS Indianapolis, more than 18,000 feet below the surface of the Philippine Sea. The discovery brought a measure of closure to the few remaining survivors and the families of those lost. High-definition photographs showed the once proud cruiser broken and rusting on the ocean floor, a silent memorial to the men who died aboard her or in the waters above her final resting place. Today, the story of the USS Indianapolis stands as a stark reminder of the chaos of war, the fallibility of human systems, and the extraordinary capacity for both suffering and survival that exists within us. For the men who floated for days in the Pacific, watching their friends die one by one, the experience represented humanity stripped to its most elemental, a fight for life against impossible odds, where courage, brotherhood, and sometimes mere chance determined who lived and who became shark food. Of the 316 men who survived the ordeal in the water, fewer than a dozen remain alive today. In their twilight years, these men continue to share their story, ensuring that the sacrifice of their shipmates and the lessons of the Indianapolis disaster are not forgotten. Cletus LeBeau, one of the surviving radio men, perhaps put it best in his final interview before passing away in 2021. People ask if I'm haunted by what happened, by the men we lost. The truth is, I'm more haunted by their courage. How men shared their life jackets with friends who didn't have one. How the strong helped the weak. How no one gave up as long as they had breath. That's what stays with me. Not the sharks or the thirst or the fear, but the best of humanity, showing itself in the worst of circumstances. The sinking of the USS Indianapolis, the failure to notice its absence, and the terrible days that followed represent a tragedy composed of many smaller failures, of equipment, of communication, of decision-making. But in the survival of 316 men against overwhelming odds, in their fight to return home, and in their later battle to clear their captain's name, we find something else, a testament to human resilience and the enduring power of truth, even when it takes decades to emerge from the shadows of history. As the deep Pacific waters continue their eternal vigil over the rusting remains of the Indianapolis, the lessons of her loss and the story of her survivors remain as relevant today as they were in those desperate days of July 1945. In a world still plagued by conflict, miscommunication, and institutional failures, The Indianapolis reminds us of the terrible cost of mistakes and the incalculable value of each human life. For the men of the Indianapolis, those who returned and those who became part of the ocean, the simple, terrible truth remains. They delivered the components that would end one war, only to find themselves fighting another, more primal battle for survival. Many lost that fight. Those who won it carried its scars forever. And there you have it, friends. The true story of the USS Indianapolis, one of the most heartbreaking yet inspiring tales of survival in modern history. I want to thank you for staying with me through this long and difficult journey. It's stories like these that remind us of both the terrible cost of war and the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. If you found this story as powerful as I did, please consider hitting that subscribe button to join our Darkling Fables family. Your support allows me to continue researching and sharing these important historical accounts that might otherwise fade from memory. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts or any questions you might have about the Indianapolis tragedy. I read every comment and love connecting with this amazing community we're building together. And if you know anyone with connections to naval history or the greatest generation, please share this video with them. The dwindling number of World War II veterans means these first-hand accounts become more precious with each passing day. Until next time, remember that by bearing witness to these stories of suffering and courage, we honor those who lived them. This is Darkling Fables, keeping history's darkest moments illuminated so we might learn from them.